So a couple weeks ago, actually a couple of months ago now, Solveig came onto IRC and asked if somebody could give a talk about future modules and what that would make it into TaskKensho. I said I would love to do something like that, and then realized I wasn't exactly sure what future modules would be going into TaskKensho. So I spent some time since he asked thinking about that as I was building this talk. Um, about where TaskKensho's come from, some recent changes in my life that have given me some new insights and thoughts about where TaskKensho could probably go in the future. And this talk is a brief overview of that, and hopefully there's some recommendations for some modules people haven't thought of so far. And I apologize, the sun has moved past my shade to block it and is making the light here very difficult. Did we just lose my camera? Talk about video difficulties. Can you still see me? Uh, okay. Um, you can see my slides. Okay, good. First, a sad news last night. We found out last night that Dave Adler, who's been a major member of the Perl community for as long as I've been around, uh, I shouldn't have. Can you still see my slides? No, it the camera disconnected from my computer for some reason. Oh, it's back now. Okay, there we go. Um, sad news. I found out last night that Dave Adler had passed away. I don't know how many people know DHA or here or on the stream, but he's one of the reasons that I participated as heavily as I did in the Perl community. He was genuinely one of the nicest people, and I wanted to dedicate this the rest of this talk to him because I'd had a lot of conversations with him about this over the years. About me, a brief. I have a dark secret. I haven't been paid to be a professional Perl programmer in several years at this point. Um, and this past April, I was hired to be an engineering manager, and I've really stopped programming heavily in my day-to-day. It's for a startup in New York. We're hiring if anybody wants to ask questions about that, and we have contract work through AAW for people who aren't American citizens or eligible to work in the United States. But this isn't about that. From working in other languages for the last couple of years, Go, Rust, TypeScript, and specifically the experiences I've gained from being an engineering manager and thinking about onboarding new developers, has actually provided me a better insight into the ideas behind TaskKensho and given me some focus on maybe where it should be going. And that's driven some of the ideas behind this talk. First, let me start with the background on TaskKensho. The name Kensho comes from a Japanese word for enlightenment. I thought it was a cute name back in 2008 when I first sat down to write it. That was during a period where things were being named Moose and Plaque and Catalyst and all sorts of interesting names. So naming something Kensho was appealing at the time. Kensho as I learned it then, is a brief moment of enlightenment where you realize the non-duality of the subject and the object, that we're just part of the world and the world is part of us all at the same time. I started TaskKensho in 2008 mostly to stop Matt Trout, MST, from complaining that there was no kitchen sink Perl. There'd been a lot of discussions about what packages should people have, what should new people start with, what should be like a default standard install for Perl. I went around to lists in the day of what was the most popular modules, what were the things that people were using. I went through the people that I knew from uh, IRC and the Perl consulting company that I worked for, Infinity Interactive, and several other people, and compiled and curated a list of what I thought were the most popular modules. The idea was then to turn that into a distribution. The enlightened Perl organizations enlightened Perl core, but I didn't know how to build a distribution, um, and I didn't know how to add new modules to the core distribution to a Perl package to release. So that didn't actually ever happen. I did, however, know how to make a task module, which was a relatively new concept at the time, which was just a way to install several different dependencies all at once. Task module came out of this. TaskKensho is currently maintained by Karen Etheridge, who does a fantastic job. It's curated via a public GitHub repository where people can file issues and PRs. And as we go through, as we make time and find the time to go through them, we add modules and do releases on a semi-frequent basis. The rest of this talk is going to be talking about some modules that I think we should add to that list. Well, first, there's some similar lists out there. MST went back later and made up his own list that's very similar to TaskKensho in the way that it's broken out. I found an awesome Perl list on GitHub. The awesome lists are a relatively new phenomenon compared to TaskKensho for how for finding useful things in various languages. There's one for Go and Rust and pretty much every language on the planet, and somebody had written one for Perl, which is very, very good. And listed in that awesome list is a list of other lists where I also found Slavin's CPAN in a nutshell, which was another very good list and a quick introduction to Perl and some of Perl's quirks at the very beginning of it. I highly recommend Googling and looking for those. Some things that won't change anytime soon in TaskKensho. Modulicious still seems to be best of class for building web applications. I was not initially a Modulicious convert. I worked with it at a previous job and became a convert after working with it. It's a good piece of software, well designed, and deserves its place there. DBIX class is still one of the best ways to work with a database in any language I've used so far. Datetime, Disilla, CPAN, CPAN minus, and Carton, all of these are core staples that we've had for several years now, and they're not going away from our recommendation anytime soon. Some quick hits. When I was doing research for this talk, I found some things that probably should be quick little wrappers or small modules that could go in. CPAN outdated gives you a list of all of the outdated modules in your current P5 lib, which is incredibly useful, especially if you work in an environment where you have to update frequently or you're constantly trying to keep ahead of what may or may not be broken with the leading edge of modules. Path Tiny is one of the better modules I've used for dealing with the file system. It's a no-brainer to me. It's one of the first things I reach for. Pod CPAN doc is like Perl is a Perl doc compatible script for looking up modules that if they're not on your local machine, it grabs them from the CPAN index. So you can get documentation for anything that's ever been released on CPAN in a Perl doc-like container. And in fact, Sean went through the effort to make it fully Perl.doc compatible so you could replace your Perl.doc command line with cpan doc and it'll just work. Git wrapper is a good wrapper around the Git binary for dealing with and automating Git scripts and dealing with the Git module. It's currently maintained by John Anderson. It's been very, very stable for a very long time. And a lot of my world is dealing with Git repositories anymore. Serial, capture tiny, these are things that shave off the edges of the rough edges of some of our workflows, and they just should have been included a long time ago. A lot of these modules I got in this list, I pulled from places like Task Be Like RJBS, which is Rick Signius's list of modules he finds useful and wants to have installed on his machines whenever he boots up a new development environment. Digging through gives you a good list of possibilities that you should look at further. Getting into specific recommendations, Perl Language Server. Perl Language Server is a module that implements Microsoft's language server protocol that they use for visual source code. The reason I recommend this is at my new job, pretty much all of the new developers use use VS Code rather than Vim, Emacs, TextEdit, TextMate, any of the other editors that I've seen before. Having a language server that implements that implements a protocol to allow us to do highlighting and expansion and documentation lookup, etc., is just incredibly useful. If we want to capture new developers, we need to make sure that the tools that they're already using support the language that we have. This should be a no-brainer to put into something like TaskKensho. I mentioned Disilla earlier. As I was going through this, I found Karen Etheridge's Disilla bundle, Disilla plugin bundle Ether, which is her module that codifies how she releases modules using Disilla. One of the core fundamental productivity measurements that you can have for a software development team is how fast can they release new features or bug fixes and get feedback from customers. The book Accelerate really hammered home on this. As I read it recently, the highest performing teams at Google and at startups and nonprofits were the teams that were able to flexibly release code quickly to their developers. Disilla makes that incredibly easy. It makes it very, very simple and straightforward. And it means that if you are context shifting constantly, you have one known configuration that will make sure that all your modules are released in the same way. I found this particularly useful myself several years ago when my Disilla configuration was messed up, and I accidentally uploaded my local lib directory to cpan as part of a distribution and overwrote Moose and broke half a cpan. Karen came back and fixed my plugin bundle for me and said, here, do this, and it fixed it, and it would never happen again. The automation is powerful. It can be a two-edged sword, but honestly, I think it's the most useful thing that we can provide to people. The idea of making a TaskKensho official bundle is something that I stumbled across as I was doing the research for this talk. I'm not sure exactly what that would look like, but it would probably look very similar to Karen's plugin bundle. There's a bunch of new features coming in Perl 536 and in Perl 534 already. Some of them are written by Paul Evans, who's Leonerd on IRC and in other places, and he does a fantastic job of trying to make sure that when he writes new syntax for the core, it's backwards compatible. So the new, he's written new try-catch syntax. It's actually in 534, but it's broken in some fundamental ways, and there's a fix in 535 that will come out in 536. that will be fantastic. Feature compat try will, if you include it in your code, will automatically use that feature if you're on a Perl that's new enough for it, or will use syntax keyword try, which is the XS implementation that's living on CPAN, to make sure that your code just runs seamlessly with the same syntax, and it's forward compatible. Anything we can do to encourage people to try the newest syntax and to upgrade their understanding of Perl and to use new stuff, we should be including in a distribution like TaskKensho. In that same vein, Paul also wrote a feature called defer, which works kind of like goes defer. Defer blocks are executed when the program leaves a specific scope. So if you have an if block, you can do some initialization at the beginning of the block, or if you have a subroutine, you can do some initialization at the beginning of a subroutine, connect to a database, set up some fixtures, connect to a remote port, whatever. Immediately on the next line after you do the initialization routine, you can put a defer block that will run when the subroutine's exited. And in that defer block, you can do all the teardown. You can do logging saying, hey, this is when I entered, this is when I exited. Those paired ideas, those concepts that really need to be together, don't have to live on opposite sides of the subroutine just because that's when they're executed. They can live in the same place so they can be maintained easily together. It's one of the features that I found in Go that I found incredibly useful in my day-to-day work. It became something I missed anytime I moved to another language that didn't have that feature, and I'm really happy to see that it's coming in Perl. In that same vein, feature compat defer implements this in a backwards compatible way, so you can have it on, I believe, 5.21 and forward, possibly as back as 5.18, I'm not sure. But it's something that should be in a module like TaskKensho, just like this try syntax. And not the last module, but the last new feature that I'm stealing from another language that I wanted to talk about. Future async await adds async await syntax to Perl. If you haven't worked in JavaScript or TypeScript like my current job, async await basically wraps every subroutine in a promise so that concurrency is very, very natural and flows the way you would think. Async is a tag on the beginning of a subroutine that says the return from the subroutine will be a promise. Await says if I get a promise, wait until that promise is resolved before moving to the next line. It makes what was very, very circuitous callback code very straightforward. The only thing that you have to do is you have to be careful that you're making sure that you await all the promises that come back and asyncing the things that need to be asynchronous. I have a feeling, and there's been some discussion, that code similar to future async await will end up in Perl core at some point. If it does, there will be a feature compat module for it, I'm sure. But until then, getting used to this concept and getting used to this code using future async await is fantastic. It's a feature that people coming from other languages are expecting. It makes a lot of sense. One of the things I'm doing in my current job is we manage a REST-like JSON API using HTTP, and the front end, it's a open API schema, or Swagger, if anybody's heard of that. The important part there is our API endpoints are defined by JSON schemas. When I was working with Karen a couple of years ago, she started implementing, she looked at that we were doing something similar in Perl, and the JSON schema module wasn't up to date with the latest JSON schema specification, and so she went about fixing that and updating it and modernizing it. It required some fundamental changes to the way the implementation worked, so she ended up making her own version. This is the most recent one. If you're doing anything complex with JSON and you're sending it over the wire, writing a JSON schema for it really does make things a lot easier and a lot more straightforward. I have found it incredibly useful. We use Postgres to store JSON documents in the database, and we're translating things in and out. Having JSON schema to make sure that those are regularized to what we're expecting is just incredibly useful. This module really empowers that, and so I would include something like this um, in TaskKensho to encourage people to look at that and to move forward with that kind of data integrity. Um, I saved this one for last because this is the big one. I've spent most of my career as a object-oriented programmer. I was learning object orientation before I started as my earliest days of programming, and one of the things that attracted me to Perl was the fact that it was multi-paradigm and I could do object orientation. Little did I know back then what Perl's object framework primitives looked like, and it was good and useful from a learning technique perspective. But now, further on in my career, it's less useful to understand how object-oriented programming is put together than it is to just use it on a day-to-day. A lot of that has changed when I became involved with the Moose project. Um, it really opened my eyes to a lot of how much power there could be in having good abstractions and good syntax for driving things forward. Uh, the last few years, while I've wandered away from Perl and worked in Go and Rust and TypeScript, I've seen how other languages implement and present their object frameworks and their object-oriented features. Some of them are just as primitive or nearly as primitive as Perl's built-in natives, but the syntax and the way they codify things and the way they organize their ideas is less bare bones than Perl, and I find that very useful. Um, Curtis Poe, also known as Ovid, has a project called Carina, which is looking to try and implement a modern syntax for object orientation in the Perl core and bring it up to date. And ObjectPad is Paul Evans' implementation of the concepts there that's driving his ideas behind how he would implement the core version of this. Um, it's incredibly powerful. It's very different from Moose or traditional Perl object orientation. It's called ObjectPad because the attributes inside an object are stored as lexicals inside uh, a class, and they have their scope is limited to instances. It's a very different way to think about object-oriented programming, but it gives us better first-class primitives, in my opinion, than the ones that Perl's native object system provides. Um, in my opinion, this is going to be the future, and having something like this in TaskKensho just prepares people to look at it and think about it and move forward with it. Um, yeah, uh, I want to thank you. This is a little faster than I was expecting, um, mostly because of the audio difficulties and the issues at the beginning. Um, and I'm used to interactive talks, so I wanted to make sure I saved some time for some of that. If you have any questions, by all means, let's go ahead and ask them, or I can flip over to an off-stream location to do that too.